Welcome to the Standards Michigan Weekly Focus teleconference, where the doors open to discuss the week's work, but also we expand upon the underlying philosophy and strategy that guides that work. We schedule these open teleconferences at a time when the work week is winding down and when our more reflective discussions do not crowd our production calendars, what we do to write codes and get votes, in the middle part of the week. As Mike Anthony likes to say, writing code and getting votes is what we do to pay the rent. The fundamental currency of what we do is ideas, getting them supported with data and onto the agendas of technical and business standards development committees, more or less on an hourly basis. Although we support the education industry, we are less in the business of standards education and more in the business of standards advocacy for the public user interest. We always prefer that these Friday teleconferences be more of discussion and a lecture. We do post almost all of them on our YouTube channel, and we get about 50 views per week, enough, we think, to meet an obligation to be open, transparent, and accessible, as well as open to challenges to our business model. So with that, let me introduce everyone on the call. First, we have Dennis Johnson with the University of Michigan. And Dennis, if you could just briefly tell us what it is that you do.
I'm a research assistant for Mike Anthony, and I deal with the videos.
Well, he's also a graduate student at the College of Urban Planning. He's learning everything about smart and sustainable cities, and it's moving even faster than he moves. Go ahead.
And sports standards.
And sports standards. We're going to roll out a bunch of sports standards probably nobody ever knew existed.
Excellent. Thank you, Dennis. Next, we have Mike Toner in LA. Mike, could you just share with us a bit about what you've been doing?
Oh, sometimes he's muted.
Yeah, I think I'm muted. Yeah, so right now I am brainstorming a video for, to highlight the relationship between the user interest, general interest, and the consumer. But my phone's not functioning here. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. And today we also have Ted Widener with Purdue University. Ted, could you say a couple of words, please?
I'm just a regular attendee who also teaches construction engineering and management at Purdue.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us today. Some have estimated that for every research dollar originating from the federal government for research projects, that colleges and universities spend 40 cents to count that same dollar to ensure that there is no waste, fraud, and abuse of that dollar. Most research universities have an overhead burden where much of our work is focused, and the federal government recognizes that our nation's research universities need to cover the overhead costs of generating new knowledge. Our industry's financial managers have used the uniform guidance in A21 and A110. Because of the economic burden to comply with the rules for the use of federal money, OMB developed what is known as Super Circular, which, while it may have reduced the waste in accounting practices, it expanded the scope of OMB circulars deeper into the relationships nonprofits have with their own suppliers. Arguably, there has been no net reduction in the amount of hourly resources needed because the dimensions of accountability have been greatly expanded. The prescriptive compliance requirements of the OMB circulars are not unlike the prescriptive requirements of the National Electrical Code in our view. The accounting industry and the electrotechnical industry, both essential to the U.S. economy, need to have their operating rules and terms of art and generally accepted financial and electrical safety principles. There is an important difference, however. Insofar as the use of government money is concerned, neither the Government Accounting Standards Board nor the Office of Management and Budget are organizations that develop standards on the platform of the American National Standards Institute, which requires an open, transparent, balanced platform for leading practice discovery. The accounting profession would be well served to engage in a standards development process through ANSI. Both the GASB or OMB do permit public comment, although there seems to be a lack of active engagement regarding their requirements. Robust, open public comment helps provide a foundation for more effective acceptance of the accounting standards they develop and promulgate. This could be accomplished in a more transparent and productive effort via the ANSI process. It is our conviction that while it may be true that not all industries need to discover leading practice on an ANSI accredited platform, almost all of them could be more effective if they were. Visitors to our website will observe that we have been posting developments in the FASB and GASB Accounting Standards Suite. Both organizations seem to be stepping up their social media presence to make their actions more transparent and to elicit input that will make their standards more effective. We are pleased to see this trend. What is happening with the OMB circulars, however, is rather different. In the case of A119, there has not been a great deal of public familiarity or discourse apart from what is known among the U.S. standards community, led by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And for the details on that, I will now be turning over the call to Mike Anthony, who is our lead on this project.
Let's leaven things a little bit. Let's listen to what NIST does, National Institute of Standards and Technology, because they are ultimately the organization to whom most of the, I'll call the ANSI community, the standards development community, look up to as the organization that's reportable to the Office of Management Budget. And we can talk a little bit about the Office of Management Budget, but it is an important relationship. And actually, NIST has been around in various different forms. We can't cover that right now, but let's kind of understand the role, this very important role that NIST has with private industry and the government.
Most people think of NIST as a federal laboratory that only works to improve measurements, but its true central mission is to enable innovation. But how does a measurement agency support innovation? Well, if you know how to measure something, then you can begin to think about how to design it, to build it, and to make it better. And these capabilities really are the essence of technological innovation. Measurements permeate every aspect of our lives. From how we make things, to how we sell things, to how we regulate things. And NIST measurements give us a way to know we can trust this system to be accurate. Today, the technologies that are most important to us are not single standalone technologies. They are actually systems of technologies that need to work with each other. And how they work together is defined through standards. In the United States, standard setting is led by industry, but NIST plays a critical role in supporting, defining, and fostering that effort and coordinating it with the federal government. NIST's role among technical agencies is unique in many ways. Over our long history, we have cultivated deep scientific roots that cut across a whole range of disciplines. Having such strong and varied scientific expertise without being a regulatory agency is what allows us to work so closely with such a broad spectrum of industries and other government agencies. And NIST cooperates with similar organizations around the world to make sure that the system of measurements we use here works on a global scale. So when you think of innovation, think of any technology around you. The odds are that NIST played an essential role in making that happen.
It's noteworthy that Rich was at the Standards Engineering Society meeting last week in Baltimore, and he presented with a gentleman who wrote a book called I think it was about metric system. Christine, do you recall the author's name offhand? If you don't, that's fine.
John,
What was his name?
John Massini. John Massini.
That's right. Christine prepared Rich's. She did a very nice job getting Rich prepared for that. You wouldn't have thought that that having a person who wrote a book about why the metric system failed here And then I guess we had somebody from the Commerce Department, the World Trade Organization there also on the stage with them. Somehow they pulled it all together. So I thought it was interesting that we always think of NIST as the one that just does measurement. And I think Lord Kelvin had something to say about if you could measure it, it matters. So that's their role. But more important to our discussion here today and how it relates to OMB Circular A119, and we'll say specifically we'll deal with the problem of research universities because they touch OMB circulars. They touch OMB circulars for their accounting principles. But Circular A119 is really the practical application of the American National Standard System insofar as government is concerned. There really is no way to really understand it. So I've taken a few of it's a very complicated piece of legislation. You'll see it. We actually had covered the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act once in February. That was me and a couple other people pulling together what we knew at the time. And I think we did a serviceable job of it, but it did set us up to get the interest of people who are closer to that action. If you go back on our website or our YouTube list, you'll see it was Part 2, National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, and you can see Andy Updegrove as an attorney in those spaces, fill in a lot of detail. So farther downstream, though, after you deal with the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act and what it allows industries such as ours to do, you necessarily arrive at the doorstep of the Office of Management Budgets, A119, and it largely is directed to federal agencies. Those federal agencies actually have to report to NIST to tell them that they have not overreached into private industry. There's a great temptation for what we call generically incumbent interests: manufacturers, insurance, labor, enforcement. All of those organizations that have big, nice buildings within a half mile of the White House, yeah, those buildings, all those folks have a tendency to try to drive their market agenda through the U.S. standard system. And so what you have is a bit of a firewall here. This legislation says you shall let industries be self-determined and let innovation come from those industries rather than trying to repeat some of the expertise that's required to set the standards through the federal government. So you'll start to see that in a little bit more detail farther as we get down into the text. These are just a few bullet points. Before I go any further, Ted, is there any questions? Christine, anything? I've talked in very broad strokes here. Anything that I missed you want to add to or comment upon?
Nothing to say right now.
Okay, then, so what you see here then are the four main reasons. I drew this right from the legislation, and we're going to get right into it and go after it point by point, only just to give a flavor of how this is related to the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act. So let's get back. I think I might have gone over it. Here's what I did. Now here's where Prezi helps you. A lot of my colleagues are not fond of it, including my boss. But here's where Prezi does help. So again, these circulars are intended to make sure that there's no waste, fraud, and abuse. We understand the greater familiarity lies with the accounting, the accounting enterprises within our industry who want to make sure that federal grant research, other federally funded projects are accounted for appropriately. But there's also A119 is directed to prohibiting federal agencies from wasting money by trying to write technical standards. So here you say, I've highlighted parts of it. We can't get into all of it, but here's the memorandum that comes from OMB. Now, I guess this is probably a good enough point to raise the question. There are many federal politicians that say, elected representatives who don't believe the Office of Management Budget has authority. They will routinely in congressional hearings say, well, that's just the Office of Management Budget. They're not a consensus body. They're an executive branch. That's not what we're talking about here. We have enough of a firewall right now to have a practical way of making sure that our industry isn't overburdened with federal or regulation, which is often driven by market agendas of incumbent interests. So here we are. Let's get here. So they do recognize here that there are other types of standards. You know, we've talked a lot about we talked a lot about American national standards, but there are other organizations like the Financial Accounting Standards Board, the Government Accounting Standards Board. They have their own processes. I don't want to fetch out to them because we're probably running up to our time limit here. How are we doing on time, Chief? We're doing okay. So there's we do where we feel it's appropriate and useful to our industry, and you go to our website and you'll see this. You'll begin to see that we are following what I'll call non-ANSI standards, and some of them are obvious. Obviously, the accounting profession, but it turns out that the International Code Council has one American national standard, but they're most politically visible and the ones that are most used and promulgated by local governments, so the International Building Code, the International Mechanical Code, they are not ANSI accredited. On our webpage for this week's that covers this topic, you'll see in fact, I wrote a little opinion piece on this. Don't let me forget to get to that, Christine.
Okay.
Where we frequently show the voting blocks. Those voting blocks are not balanced. And some believe that that's what we should be driving toward. Others believe, well, no. And as Andy said back when we talked about Part 2 of the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, he says you're not going to get the user interest, at least the consumer. The consumer won't do it. They're just too busy doing other things. In a sense, he reminded us that the standards development is essentially a scaled down version of participatory democracy, and we should not be surprised if we don't get a lot of interest because we have a hard time getting half of our people to vote. And if we say, we can argue, well, let's get more people to vote, let's have voting on weekends like the Swedish do. And then, of course, there'll be argument over whether you really do want. There'll be ambivalence about whether we really do want to have that many people vote. So that's just a flavor of what that discussion was all about. Maybe the user really isn't the one that should be in these meetings. Maybe they're not informed enough. We happen to think quite otherwise, and that's why we do what we do. Okay, so does this policy establish a preference between consensus and non-consensus standards developed in the private sector? It does not. You will not see FASB in here, GASB. You will not see ICC in here. There are a number of other disciplines. Some of them, I believe, are associated with other parts of the financial industry and even the healthcare industry that don't want their standards of care, their benchmarks to be open to competitor interests. And until there's enough of a movement in their market to change that, they're not motivated to change. I'm reminded by our colleague George Gula at the American National Standards Institute that probably only about 20% of the U.S. economy is governed by standards. That's still a lot. That's 20% of what do we have to 18 trillion now? But that's still a fair amount left. That's 3.6 trillion. Okay, so should my agency give preference to performance standards? Of course they should. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done. International standards are almost exclusively performance standards. But the history of standards development in the United States are one that started with prescriptive requirements. Prescriptive requirements are what the enforcement interests like. They prefer those because it's less risk placed upon them. And if you're not trading risk in these committee meetings, you're trading dollars. Or if you're not trading dollars, you're trading risk. So performance standards are better for the owner, that would be us, but they're not so good for the inspector, who will be then put in a position of defending why did you approve for occupancy a particular building that didn't meet these, that it sure didn't look like it was going to perform well. And he'll come back and say, well, it was my judgment at the time. If you'd given me some prescriptive standards, then I would have been able to, to check it off. So there's always this struggle between prescriptive and performance. And I think the United States standard system is moving toward performance standards. But as I said, that we have a legacy, quite a long legacy of simply wanting to develop checklists to make it easier for the enforcement interest. Let's see what else here. So I'm going to zoom around to the next yellowed area here and get to that. Are we done? Okay, so that's done. This is about, 12 pages or so. It's not as bad as it seems. How am I doing on time there, Dennis?
You are.
Okay. Well, I find out how
10
much.
minutes.
10 minutes. 10 minutes to
We've been
go.
talking for 10 minutes.
Okay. So what is the policy for federal participation consensus bodies? So these are just some questions, and this is all I'll be trying to answer them. Answer them farther down. Again, the tone of this legislation is directed specifically to government agencies. Government agencies, you shall not try to write your own standards, no matter how many lobbyists show up at your door, to make a market in carbon monoxide sensors, or there to try to make more of their particular disciplines billable hours. I think yesterday I made a point about duct smoke detectors and how many people don't believe that we really need to have them on both the supply and return air fan. Well, it's important because those things can run $2,000 to $5,000 each, and they're difficult to maintain. And we may have as many as 100 to 2. We have 1 million of them already in place, and they may not be effective. But if you're the sheet metal manufacturers, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe the sheet metal manufacturers have a nice place not too far from the White House. They will go and try to convince somebody in the federal government to, they may not do it explicitly, but they'll find a way. There's always very interesting ways that they make markets for themselves. Let's have more duct smoke detectors because we have more billable hours for that. And that's what labor does. When will this circular be? Okay, so there's a review. And again, I suppose I should be careful what I say. That's what labor does. They're asserting their interests just like we are. We're saying we're trying to find the right balance. We cannot possibly keep these buildings up according to all the prescriptive rules that arrive on a doorstep by the hour. So we have to make deals with labor to say, look, let's find a way to scale the expertise that's necessary to guarantee the safety that we all want, but we cannot do everything, and be careful about using the standards development process to make a market for your members. But this is America, after all, and you're entitled to lobby as you feel appropriate. Any thoughts here, Ted, Christine? I'm getting kind of tired of talking. Dear, I'm on my own.
Well, Mike, I think there has been this absence of involvement through ANSI. There certainly isn't perhaps the level of awareness in the accounting profession regarding ANSI as there is, let's say, in the construction profession, due to the fact that safety has been a driver for setting standards, for example, in the construction industry. And to what extent is someone unsafe if they don't know the correct accounting standard?
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. Of course, your retirement might be at risk, but
right. And I knew you would say that. So we can extrapolate what safety means as well. But if we mean physical safety, then certainly there has been an impetus for consensus and standards development for the construction industry because you don't want people occupying a building if it's not safe.
Mhm.
So I think the motivation historically has been there for that profession, that industry, versus the accounting profession.
Mhm.
There are other administrative management um, professions or areas, for example, healthcare management or human resource management, where they have been slower to come to the table at ANSI, although those are at the table. So
Yeah, you're right. Texas is leading the healthcare standard for healthcare administration, which well, that's an awfully big bite. I teased Lee Webster about that. You're going to try to get an American national standard for healthcare administration? And his answer was, yeah, in Texas we do big stuff. So here we are. All right, again, just they're saying in a different. What are the purposes of it? I think this is kind of repetitious. Um, I think they're being very orthodox about it. Administrative force. So I brought this to everyone's attention because I know that we're hard upon a new election cycle and election year, and Christine and I have been tracking the movement of let's call it a EPAC revisit through both the House and the Senate. And I think there's also variants of it. There's the Smart Building Acceleration Act. It's kind of fun to go searching on the various government websites and put the word in energy, and you can pick up 10, 20 legislators that got some sort of draft legislation for energy or energy conservation. Okay, my point is that this one may directly address the Department of Energy, with whom we think we have a very collegial relationship. If you go on our website, you'll see that we are discussing within ourselves, among ourselves, and those of our standards, our set of standard scholars, some of the DOE proposals for the International Energy Conservation Code. I know that many were in the standards committee and even the sustainability committee were complaining that the Department of Energy had an outsized influence on the direction of the International Energy Conservation Code. And they may be right, but this clause does seem to support the idea that the Department of Energy, representing the government and representing the interest of the elected government. I mean, we change our leaders every year, and they have their own agenda. And when the vote's taken, we have to even if we're the minority, we really should respect what the majority wants. In this case, they believe that we need stronger, faster-moving energy standards. And they specifically mention the International Energy Conservation Code, and they mention ash rate. And that means that the Department of Energy can use taxpayer dollars to attend these meetings. And this more or less so in the ICC suite, for example, you may well, especially in this last part of the revision cycle for them, you may see a rather dominating presence of the Department of Energy. But to be fair, they have given at least a year notice of what they want to see in the next International Energy Conservation Code. Go to the website. You can just search on IECC, and we've been tracking them all. And they have about maybe 20 to 30 proposals for residences as well as the commercial buildings. And it's not, they may not be there directly. Very often they have organizations or other interests. I think Georgia Tech is a university that's very close to the Department of Energy, and I believe and there's also scholars, sustainability activists that are directly employed by the education industry will collaborate and align themselves with the Department of Energy. So I think we should put to rest the complaint that the DOE is not using public money appropriately when they fly half the meeting attendees. I'm exaggerating. I'm sure it's not half that. I'm sure it's something reasonable. I haven't met anybody unreasonable over there, frankly. Working for a nonprofit as well as I understand the constraints they have. Believe it or not, they have money problems too over there. Okay, so let's try to chew through the last bit of this, and I won't dwell as much on this. So what are the goals? All right, so we already know what the goals are. I think I just repeated. Well, they go into more detail here. You know, honestly, I think you probably trim this down 20% and not lose much, but you know, I didn't write it. The term standard, okay, so we can dwell along. This is here for those of you who like to wordsmith about what the standards are doing. I'm sorry, I'm not running my mouse so well. What else do we have down here? Are there any limits on the number of federal participants in voluntary consensus bodies? So I think that speaks to what my last statement was about you may have a better part of 1,000 people at the International Energy Conservation Code meetings, and you know, a significant number of them. But I think what they're saying should be kept in minimum required for effective representation of the various program technical or other concerns of federal. So again, these are the rules that federal agencies have for their engagement in privately developed standards. And I think we're getting close to the end. Ted, you've been quiet. I put you asleep?
Well, best not to speak and reveal one's ignorance is all I have to say.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess I'm pretty dumb. Anyway, here, consensus. All right, this is fun. I think this is almost a worldwide agreement. Everybody knows what. It doesn't necessarily mean unanimity, whether it's 51%, whether it's 67 or 80%, or if there's no dominating majority, you know, as some of the parliamentary systems in Europe. So unanimity, plenty of that. Non-consensus, once again, we get into these variants. So there might be a larger discussion about this. I know, and this is not a topical area, there have been challenges to this, and the White House has made some other statements, some memoranda, I believe are also on our website somewhere, where they said, well, they put a little bit more spice into this document. I think what they said there, if I recall, if we don't like what's happening, we have the right to convene. And I think their intention was that they respected this process and they respected the OMB's obligation to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse through this directive, but maybe they weren't even comfortable with what OMB was doing. So, you know, could have turned out to be one of those turf battles we all know about. So what is a policy on conformity assessment? This is very important. How do you know? It's one thing to have a standard, but you got to have some enforcement of it. So here's where we can come back to NIST and where I kind of want to end our discussion into the text of this. Section 12 requires NIST to coordinate federal and state agencies in conformity assessment with private sector standards in conformity, blah, 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 with the goal of eliminating unnecessary duplication and complexity of development, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so there we are. So we see NIST, again, their key role in being the bridge between private industry and government. And so then finally you have some reporting, and that gets us right back to where we started, which was a lot of our industry's familiarity has to do with the reporting of how federal money is being used to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. But the U.S. standard system, with which we're deeply engaged, is also a way for the government to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse through a far more subtle process. So I think I'm all talked out, folks. I don't have much more to say on that. So somebody else say something. Christine?
Yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you for sharing all of that information. And now what I would like to do is just take care of some housekeeping. If you are interested in attending the ANSI presentation at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business on September 25th, we will be hosting the CEO, Joe Bhatia. There is information on the Standards Michigan website. Right at the top of the page, you can click on the link that says UM Welcomes ANSI 2015, where you will also find an RSVP link, and my email will be the email that you will send your RSVP to. So it's free of charge, and if you would like to attend remotely, we will be providing a webinar link as well. Joe's presentation will be open to the entire education facilities industry, and we are looking forward to a great attendance both in person as well as remotely. I would like to thank those of you who have attended our live teleconference, and for anyone who watches it later, thank you for watching, and we will see you hopefully again next week. Thank you and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.